Roxy, I've been in Ohio for 2 weeks. What do you think are the three biggest differences culturally between Ohio and New York City, besides that you're not here in Ohio?
Less walking from place to place, more driving.
Yes. I don't want to look at my steps tracker. It's scary.
More investment in the regional sports teams.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about sports, but that is true.
More green space.
Yes.
Like you could go outside and sit on a deck and bird watch.
Yes. I had written down more open space.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All the driving. And it's also just quieter.
Oh,
Like I walk around my
right.
parents' neighborhood and not a soul is out. Can you imagine that happening in New York?
And you probably don't have like an ambulance driving by your bedroom window at least once or twice a day.
No, it's usually just a monster truck. From Religion News Service, this is Saved by the City, a podcast from two Christian women digging through the post-election metadata to make meaning out of the mayhem. It's meaty, maddening, but much needed. I'm Katelyn Beatty.
And I'm Roxy Stone.
This week on Complexified, betrayed Muslim voters fight back. Colorado State Representative Iman Judah.
We had spent a year screaming from the mountaintops trying to warn the Democratic Party that this is something you cannot ignore. There were red flags for the party. They continued to shrug it off.
That's Colorado State Representative Iman Judah on this week's Complexified. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Despite the big cultural differences across regions of the U.S., there are some things that Ohioans and New Yorkers and plenty of others do have in common, like Thanksgiving foods. You know, for all who celebrate, there's some pretty consistent winners.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard from a little birdie recently that you will be hosting Thanksgiving this time next week.
Oh, did that get all the way out to Ohio already?
Yeah, it's like, oh, it made me sad because
I know.
Oh, I really want to be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've celebrated the last 2 or 3 together.
Yeah, I mean, last year, John went crazy on carving the turkey. Do you remember that?
Yes. And we were sort of like, well, we were on cloud 9 because we got engaged the night before. So we were very excited.
Yes.
Yeah, so our friends Alyssa and Tom have hosted Thanksgiving for several years, but they've moved and their apartment is not host ready yet. So they've asked us to host, but she's bringing the food, which is great.
Are you planning to make anything? Or is it more like, we'll provide the space, you provide the food?
Well, I will have to make something. I mean, I would feel a little sad not to make anything. I will definitely make my cranberry yam casserole, which is like a family staple.
Yes, I've had this.
Yes, of course.
It's very sweet.
And tart. The cranberries are tart. Although there's so much sugar in there. It's covered in marshmallows.
Yes. Well, I offered recently to my mom that I would make all the sides. So like mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, some kind of cranberries. I'm thinking maybe like something sweet potato-ish. I'm thinking something
What's the difference between yams and sweet potatoes?
I think yams are maybe sweeter. But I've never made a casserole with marshmallows. And I'm thinking of doing something with marshmallows. So I feel like Ohio is already molding me.
Yes. Marshmallows. The glue that holds America together.
Well, something needs to. And sugar normally does the trick. I will also say this is not so much culture shock because, of course, I grew up in Ohio. I spent a lot of time here. But I have spent the past 6 years living in New York City, which, for all of its diversity on all fronts, is a pretty solidly blue place, especially like where I lived in Brooklyn.
Less blue than in past elections. But
Well, and Ohio is also less blue than in past elections because it used to be a very significant swing state, but has gone for
Right.
Donald Trump in the past 3 elections, including this election. And I think waking up the morning after election day, seeing the results, it made me wonder if I'd been living in a bubble. Like, I was surprised by
Yeah.
the results, and then I was like, wait, is this the same kind of thing as what happened in 2016 when I was shocked, but I also didn't know anybody who was voting for the Republican candidate? So I think I have felt kind of humbled that, like, perhaps what I have experienced to be more normative is not, in fact, normative for a lot of fellow Americans.
Did you really not know anybody in 2016? Or like maybe the people you did know were not surprising? Because I definitely knew a lot of people voting Republican all the years.
I mean, I knew people who I went to high school with or like acquaintances, but not anybody I was in conversation with about politics. And I think that's maybe the reveal is like, when you're in an echo chamber, it's easy to think that the echo chamber is in fact all of reality.
Definitely. I think in 2016, I mean, I grew up with Republicans. I was in a very red part of the country growing up. And I think 2016, the surprise was, like, party loyalty is deep. Even when you don't necessarily like the candidate,
Mm-hmm.
You're going to vote the party line. I think now the surprise of this election, we've been talking about, the country is like very evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, and people vote their party, and there's not that many undecideds. There's not that many people that flip. But the whole, like every demographic almost went further right.
Were you surprised the morning after?
Surprised is not quite right. I truly didn't know. I really subscribed to the whole, it's a coin flip. We'll see. There's no way to know. We're not going to know for days.
Yeah.
So I was surprised in the sense that I did not expect to know by then.
Mm-hmm.
I was surprised that it was decisive enough to call. So far, there are not a lot of narratives that have come out of exit polls that weren't sort of talked about ahead of time, predicted in some way. I think they were just even stronger than people expected. So, for example, much was made ahead of the election about young men and the ways that Donald Trump was really courting the young male vote. I mean, I guess the surprise maybe was just that it didn't work really at all in the other direction. Like, there was also, a lot of conversation about Vice President Harris bringing Liz Cheney out and having Liz Cheney support her. And like, was that going to work to woo like evangelical women voters? And
should we have had Liz Cheney on the podcast? Well, I mean, if she had been open, I'm sure it would have been an interesting conversation.
Yes, I'm sure it would have been. So for whatever reason, the efforts on the other side were not working as much across the aisle.
I just want to share something that I saw on election night that felt to me like, I don't know that these appeals from the Democratic Party are going to land. And that was a concert that Katy Perry was performing, I believe, outside Philadelphia, where Kamala Harris came onto the stage and they took these selfies together, and Katy Perry's like official account posted these photos. I was like, this feels about a decade out of touch. I don't think that those appeals hold that much sway. I think one clear takeaway from this election is that vibes alone are not going to shift. And I'm not saying that to blame Harris or her campaign. I am saying that a little bit to blame Katy Perry, because I think she should shift careers.
Poor Katy Perry. I didn't know that that's what this episode was going to be.
I guess I shouldn't pick on her. She grew up evangelical. Her and Liz Cheney,
right.
Two interesting podcast guests we could have.
I mean, yes. And also, I don't know how to call Trump's campaign anything but vibes. It's not like we were getting clear policy positioning from him.
Yeah. He was very consistent in hammering home that he could fix the economy and his administration was going to fix things and kind of like deliver back to the American people this economic dream that they were promised that's been lost. And then also like borders and immigrants.
Borders, yeah.
Yeah, they weren't policies, but they were topics that seemed to energize voters.
Mhm.
I'm just saying, for as much as I enjoyed the memes and like the Brat Summer memes, although I'm still unclear what that means, but like,
Still don't know.
I kind of thought, like, my sister-in-law asked me the day before election, we were going on a walk, and she was like, so what do you think's going to happen tomorrow? I was like, oh yeah, I think Harris will win. Like, you know, it may be several days before we find out, similar to what happened in 2020, where, you know, we were waiting for specific states to make a call. But like, yeah, hence the bubble, which is why we need someone like today's guest to come pop it and help us get a more accurate picture of what's happening in the polling booths and beyond.
Tim Alberta is a political journalist with The Atlantic. He knows his way around complex national political trends. He's spent years documenting the alliance between Trump and white evangelicals.
In a way, Biden's presidency was better for them than Trump's presidency. Having something to fight against, being able to talk about your persecution and your marginalization is better for business, like capital B business, than being in power.
We'll hear from Tim shortly about why he thinks Trump won, where never Trumpers go from here, and why religion seemed to take a back burner in this election. But first, let's spotlight what stood out to us from the exit polls.
Data dump, data dump, data dump. Put on your nerd glasses.
Let's get to the top 5 surprises from the exit polls.
Number 5, and this one is very surprising. The youth vote veered to the right. Among young women, Biden's 35-point lead over Trump in 2020 shrunk to a 24-point lead for Harris. And among young white men without college degrees, Trump beat Harris 56% to 40%.
Number 4, 3 in 10 Black men voted for Donald Trump, doubling their support from 2020. In addition, Trump won more Black voters than any GOP candidate has in 48 years.
Number 3, the Catholic and Muslim vote also veered to the right. The Washington Post indicates that Trump did very well with Catholics, winning by a stunning 15-point margin, 56% to 41%. That is a pretty dramatic difference from the 2020 election. According to Fox News voter analysis, there was also a 28-point shift among American Muslims. In 2020, only 6% backed Trump. And in 2024, that jumped to 33%. And there are some major Arab American communities like Dearborn, Michigan, that actually went for Trump.
Number 2, post-Roe, abortion was not the galvanizing issue for the Democrats, as many had predicted. Neither the CNN exit polls nor the AP Fox survey showed any dramatic change among female voters over the past 4 years. And finally, Roxy, I give you the honor of announcing the finding about the white evangelical vote. Much discussed.
But completely unsurprising.
Yes.
The white evangelical support of Trump held steady, with 82% voting for Trump, which is basically the exact same number as the last 2 elections. I do find the abortion one particularly surprising because it was such a galvanizing issue in the midterms. What's most interesting about it in this election is that in 7 of the 10 states where abortion measures were on the ballot, voters chose to support abortion rights. In other words, to literally like enshrine them in their state's constitution. Only in 3 of the states did they not. And even in one of those states, Florida, a majority of them supported abortion rights. It just wasn't the 60% margin. I think it was 57%. And they needed 60% to actually pass the amendment. But in all of those states, more people voted for abortion rights than supported Kamala Harris. And in some of those states where they chose to enshrine abortion rights, the whole state actually went red for Trump. So people, I mean, this is the man who overturned Roe v. Wade. He is either successfully managed to distance himself from responsibility over that. Like, a lot of people are like, oh, Trump, he's not really actually anti-abortion. Or people are just like able to hold these conflicting feelings on their ballot, which we haven't seen a lot of, like to vote for abortion rights, but to choose a Republican candidate. It's just like they don't hold together in your head very easily.
Yeah.
But it's what people did.
Could it be that they're not so concerned about the overturning of Roe as long as there's some kind of state protection? It's almost like a post facto, we need to keep some kind of protection. But at the end of the day, Trump is going to do these other things that are perhaps more important to me.
Yeah. I think in the end, it really was just prioritizing the economy. And these are people who would choose abortion rights and if offered the choice, which they were. But that's not really what it felt like was on the ballot when it came to the presidential election. And what was on the ballot when it came to the presidential election, I think the data has borne out that that was mostly the economy and the border. Those were kind of like the primary issues that people seem to have voted on this year.
Including with the white evangelicals, because like the previous narrative around their support for Trump is that either like the other side was so much worse, and the other side they're very pro-life, so they're going to be against a pro-choice candidate in general. But in general, the chatter that I saw among white evangelical supporters of Trump was simply, yeah, we care about the economy and the border too. Like, their case for Trump this time around was not a moral or like cultural values case as it was we just need to get back on track.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there were attempts at making a moral argument, couching that support for Trump in some kind of moralistic, high stakes theological.
Well, God wanted him to be president because why else did he not die during his assassination attempt?
Exactly. I mean, there was certainly an attempt to, to make Trump some kind of savior, God chosen, all of that. I think we've heard from a number of Democrats attempting to sort of figure out what went wrong, that there was like, too much focus on identity politics and too much focus on these, culture war topics that felt too extreme for a lot of people. But I don't know. I mean, again, I don't think that it just doesn't seem like that's really what people were voting for. It was the economy, stupid. I mean, I think that's what...
I'll give you bonus points if you can tell me who initially said that.
I forget.
I think it was James Carville.
Well...
James Carville, 1992. What kind of prize do I get?
A big one, for sure. TBD. I think the one truly ideological vote here, and maybe ideological is the wrong word, like the true, like a moral vote, a moralistically driven vote, was probably the Muslim and Arab American vote to make a statement, to quote from an RNS article, like to punish the Biden administration for the policies in the Israel-Hamas war and what's happening in the Gaza Strip. But otherwise, I think it seems like this is mostly the economy, or mostly just a feeling of wanting change.
I've come across the word repudiation a lot.
Yes.
In the last week, more than I have in a while.
And I mean, America's not the only place this has happened. Basically, incumbents across the globe since the pandemic have been voted out of office. And so I don't know, even that, in some ways, it's like just not as surprising or not as unpredictable, maybe as it might seem, given that it's like Trump again and he's a felon and stuff.
He helped foment an insurrection on the Capitol.
So
but
sure,
like,
an unlikely candidate, but a change candidate.
Before we start veering into partisan feelings, let's introduce the organization that makes this ultimately nonpartisan podcast possible.
Religion News Service is an independent, award-winning source of global reporting on religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics.
For understanding all the complex topics not to discuss at Thanksgiving, things like religion, politics, money, global conflict, and Jerry Falwell Jr. again, visit the website religionnews.com.
We want to give a shout out to listener Monique Hernandez. She says, "Adore this podcast. Also, I can't tell you how many times a day this pops into my head. I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch." Quote unquote. Speaking of Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch, he's one of our many fellow RNS podcasts over at The State of Belief. Give him a listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
We'd also love to hear your feedback and ideas for future guests and topics. Send us an email at sbtcpodcast@religionnews.com. We'd love to hear from you.
I'm Paul Brandeis Rauschenbusch. This week on The State of Belief, Amanda Tyler, author of the new book, How to End Christian Nationalism.
People are convinced of this as being a problem. For Christian audiences in particular, they feel a religious obligation to push back against Christian nationalism as a gross distortion of our faith.
The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Distributed by Religion News Service Podcasts and available on your favorite podcast app.
We're grateful today to be joined by journalist and political commentator Tim Alberta. Tim, thanks so much for joining us in such a politically interesting time.
Hi, Tim.
Hi. Yeah, you're welcome. Politically interesting time is sort of an evergreen way to describe this past decade.
Yes, I would like it to be a little less interesting, but it doesn't seem that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Also, the phrase "this decade," it's been almost a decade.
Yes,
since the politically interesting time began.
We wanted to record this conversation with you, Tim, right after Election Day. You and many others had predicted, look, it's very possible we will not know the results for several days, and yet I woke up Wednesday morning and the results of the election were astoundingly clear. So were you surprised by that?
I think, because every indicator we had suggested that we were in for another nail biter.
And there's plenty of analysis out there about why and why he won so dramatically in what has been said to be such a divided nation. He ran way ahead even of, abortion ballot measures, which mostly went pro-choice. Obviously, there are so many factors at play here, but what have you seen to be the most compelling reason for why Trump won so clearly when the prediction was such a divided nation?
Harris actually performed at par with or better than Biden had in 2020 in a lot of these key battleground states. So it's not as though she completely flunked out. Really, if you look at Trump's numbers and if you look at Trump's coalition, he was able to turn out new voters. And we're not even talking necessarily about persuading a lot of existing voters. All of the data suggests that Trump was actually really successful in doing something that his campaign had talked for the past year about doing, which was bringing new voters into the fold, particularly young men. We're talking young working class men, and not just working class whites, but Latinos, black men. And we saw throughout the spring and summer months a really concerted effort. Trump going to UFC fights, Trump going to college football games, Trump going on all of these podcasts.
We really wanted him on to appeal to the working class young male voter. And
the Theo Bros especially. They love our podcast the best.
I'm surprised that he didn't wind up on your show. It would have been such a natural fit in so many ways. My friend Mike Pesca wrote a piece for The Atlantic the other day calling the Democratic Party America's HR department, which is like exactly right, I think, in the minds of a lot of voters, right? They're tired of the speech policing, the finger wagging. They're tired of the condescending, patronizing attitude. And you'll talk with some of these voters and they will say, I don't like Trump. He's a racist. I don't think he's a good person. But I think that I'll do better with Trump. And I think that Democrats are way more worried about all of these sort of social, cultural issues out there than they are with the economy and with my livelihood, which, by the way, is really why that Trump ad that they ran pointing to the transgender issues, saying that Kamala Harris is for they, them, and Trump is for you. One of the most effective ads we've seen in a very long time, because it broke through and spoke to something that was already kind of looming large in the subconscious of a lot of voters.
We had a column last week that was like, stop blaming this on young black men and saying this is why Trump won. And so I am just curious, like, did they really show up for Trump in a way that was like so extraordinary?
So in politics, everything is relative, right? What we saw in this particular election is that actually among every single demographic group in the country, all of them moved to the right, with the exception of older white people, and they actually moved to the left. So if anything, what we saw here is pretty extraordinary in the context of our modern political ecosystem. And the great irony here is that Trump, of all people, Trump who is calling for mass deportation, Trump who has this history of racism and xenophobia that is a part of his political brand, is still able to appeal to bigger and bigger shares of the non-white vote. And so you ask yourself, well, how is that possible? You saw pretty consistently among non-white respondents, they don't particularly like Donald Trump. What they view him as is someone who can have a positive effect on their pocketbooks, on their everyday lives, and they believe the Democratic Party is sort of disconnected and out to lunch and really not all that concerned with them. For example, Starr County down in Texas, this county is 97% Latino, and they had not voted for a Republican for president in over a century. And Trump wins that county, right? And it's a border county. And so you're looking at this and you're asking, well, how could that have happened? The simplest explanation here is that the two issues that those voters care about overwhelmingly, the economy and border security. And those are two issues where they feel like the Democratic Party has tuned them out and just is not listening to them. And so therefore, even though they don't like Trump, they're still willing to vote for him. And so I don't think that this should be mistaken for like the masses of young minority men in America suddenly wearing red hats and turning into America First disciples. I don't think it's that at all. But I do think that they have delivered a really searing judgment on the Democratic Party.
I think any of the never Trump or anti-Trump religious leaders, writers who have really tried to underscore Trump's clear like immorality, or the fact that he's not like a values vote in the way we've traditionally understood that, or have raised concerns about his authoritarian style. All of the principled moral or cultural arguments against Trump, in my view, they have fallen on deaf ears. And
they did not land.
And that perhaps a lot of those appeals, especially since they've been repeated for the last 8 years, feel a little finger waggy. It's maybe the religious version of the Democratic Party's policing around various like cultural issues, or telling people like how to think and how to talk. So where do they go from here? Do they retreat from this political engagement? Do they say, look, we just really need to turn inward and focus on the health of the local church? Where do people like David and Nancy French, Russell Moore, where do they go from here?
It's a really interesting question, and I wouldn't presume to speak for any of those folks. I do want to linger for a moment on the point you raised there, Katelyn, which is interesting. The idea that arguments around character and morality and integrity have lost their political resonance. I do think that it's really going to be fascinating now to look both at the remnant of anti-Trump evangelicals to see how they move forward, but also the very Trumpy evangelicals to see how they move forward. Because in a way, Biden's presidency was better for them than Trump's presidency. Having something to fight against, having something to oppose, being able to talk about your persecution and your marginalization is better for business, like capital B business, than being in power, right? And so I'm actually even more interested to see how the kind of MAGA evangelical industrial complex now responds, given that he's going to be back in office.
What do you think is the most important religion story coming out of the exit polls?
Honestly, I think the Muslim vote for Trump and the abandoning of the Democratic Party in places like Dearborn, Michigan, which is 25 minutes from where I live. This is a sea change. To have prominent Muslim leaders in Southeast Michigan come out and rally around Donald Trump and deliver this stinging rebuke publicly, repeatedly to the Democratic Party, I wonder if there isn't a cascading effect here in our politics. The idea 4 years ago or even 2 years ago that you would have had clerics and elected officials and community leaders from places like Hamtramck and Dearborn and elsewhere come out so strongly against the Democratic Party, and not just that, but then throw all of their weight, their organizational weight behind Donald Trump. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. It's hard to overstate how unforeseen this was and how big of an impact it had, but also just the perceptions of the Democratic Party's relationship with what was once a very loyal constituency.
We might think that like the MAGA evangelicals, people like Greg Locke, Eric Metaxas, the pastors who proudly claim the Christian nationalist label, like they're obviously in a time of rejoicing because the political leader that they have lined up behind has just decisively won a second presidential term. In what ways might Trump's second term, though, create some challenges for them?
If you consider the history of the religious right and really zero in on the critical moments of growth and sort of an increase in size, increase in relevance and influence, it has almost always come during a period of being in the wilderness, right? The moral majority is born during Jimmy Carter's presidency. Who can forget the great menace that Jimmy Carter was to American Christianity?
Building these homes for poor people.
Teaching his Sunday school.
A real heretic, that Jimmy Carter. For the America First evangelical leaders, they are, I think, in for a bit of a rude awakening come next January, because a lot of them have really built their entire brand around resistance over these past 4 years. Resistance to COVID mandates, resistance to vaccines, resistance to even the kind of manufactured conspiratorial claims of state persecution, and the idea that Biden and his allies are indoctrinating your children and using government agencies to try to subvert your communities and to come after your faith. Like, all of that has been like rocket fuel for some of these evangelical organizations and institutions and personalities. So once that's taken away from them, they're going to have to come up with something new. And obviously, I think some of them will probably be pretty successful. They'll find new ways to scare people. They'll find new ways to convince people that, you know, even though Trump is back in power, the deep state still lurks behind him and is coming for you, and we need to find a way to have the president's back. That's my expectation of what the playbook looks like.
And that's so in the water. I mean, again, not to pick on evangelicals. Fear is a very powerful motivator. It almost feels like conservative evangelicals have made fear a central piece of their public witness. I'm just preaching now. Let's move on.
No, preach. I'm here for it. I am in the front pew nodding my head and saying,
Okay,
amen.
I have
Preach
a
away.
multiple choice for you.
Oh boy.
The topic of Christian nationalism. Do you think it's A, overblown, B, talked about just the right amount, or C, much more dangerous than we were even anticipating and discussing?
Okay. I would say of those imperfect options, I might say A, only because it's so ill-defined that when it comes up as often as it does, I feel like it actually backfires and creates a rallying effect around a lot of people who hear that and they say, well, I'm a Christian and I love my country, so I guess that makes me a Christian nationalist. When really we are describing, at least I am describing, something much more specific when we're looking at Christian nationalism. And so to me, there is a danger in throwing the term around willy-nilly and not being really surgical with our application of it.
But in your view, what is the specific threat of Christian nationalism properly defined? Maybe especially moving forward.
Look, I think Christian nationalism is the marriage of bad history and bad theology. And the bad history is almost a prerequisite for the bad theology. What you're looking at here is this very sophisticated and well-financed effort to say, actually, everything you've learned about the separation of church and state, about the threat of religious tyranny, about why the founders were so clear in writing the Establishment Clause and the First Amendment to the Constitution, that's all a bunch of secular progressive propaganda. That really the founders did envision this as a Christian nation, that really the founders wanted this to be a Christian nation governed by Christian men, European Christian men, and that our institutions would be administered by a de facto Christian doctrine, and that any attempt to convince you otherwise is part of the left's scheme to eliminate Christianity in America and to persecute your faith. And it's a very compelling argument, and they can cherry pick selective writings and selective quotes and package it together in kind of a slick way to say to you, this is the time to reclaim the founders' vision for a Christian nation, for a time such as this. And here's the thing, you guys. Once you get to that place where you're convinced of that, once you get to that place of really dramatically reconsidering America's history, then you open your Bible and you start to read your scripture very differently. You become really sympathetic to this idea of America as a new Israel, America as a covenant nation, and your theology, consciously or subconsciously, becomes distorted, and you can start to think of yourself as both a Christian and as an American, not as distinct identities, but as one identity. And that fighting for America is fighting for God, because really, at the end of the day, this was a nation conceived with a mission from the Almighty to spread the gospel around the world, and that Satan's primary battlefield in this spiritual war that we are a part of is here in the United States, and that if he wins here, then he will win globally. And of course, there are all kinds of theological problems with that thinking, right? Namely, that as believers, we know that the battle is already won. And this plays, of course, into the earlier conversation, Katelyn, around fear and how fear has become such a prevalent part of our public witness and the damage that that does. But ultimately, I think it becomes very appealing to people to have a sense that actually this spiritual warfare that they've spent their entire lives marinating in, that political warfare isn't separate from it, that it's actually one and the same, and that the demonic influences that we've been warned against in our fight with the forces that are not seen, that actually they are seen. We're not just struggling with the powers and principalities, but we're struggling with something more tangible and more immediate. I just think it becomes very enticing, and I can understand why people of a certain political persuasion, ideological persuasion, cultural persuasion, why they are so susceptible
Well, on
to it.
that happy note, yeah, I'm like much more worried about Christian nationalism than I was before our conversation, because you've articulated the political and theological ramifications of it so well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm sorry if I left you on a dark note.
Saved by the City is a religion news service production. The producer is Jay Woodward, and the consulting editor is Paul O'Donnell. We get production assistance from Julia Wyndham.
Chaz Rousseau put together our look, and Martin Fowler wrote our theme music.
We are Roxy Stone.
And Caitlin Beatty.
Thanks for listening. I feel a data dump coming on. You're laughing because I said dump again.
I think it's the whole, like, I feel a data dump coming on.
You wrote that.